So, here we are. Saying that feels a bit weird just now, since the way we're here is not exactly the usual way, and yet it still feels right to say it, because it's still true. Haiku has called us once again, and we've gathered. And that phrase, which we've said so often in so many contexts, sums up, once again, our common experience. Common though it is, there's something glad about it, something that cheers us and makes us feel at home. Its knot of language holds its energy tight within it in a way that we can't quite exhaust, and so we might use it again and again without tiring of it. If we consider this expression piece by piece, we get something like this. Here, in the designated time and space, we, the conjoined mass of like-minded men and women, have existence. And binding this together, so, as a consequence of what has happened before, or more colloquially, with knowledge of the situation. Every part of this phrase and its order matters. How different would it be if we were to say, "We are so here," or "We are here, so," or simply, "We are here." So here we are, and to the here-ness and the we-ness and the are-ness, the so is ba. If you look up ba in any Japanese English dictionary, you'll find it means place or site or occasion. And these are all true in the most general sense. Ba is a pointer to a kind of awareness that something of importance is happening in time and space. Everything, properly considered, is of importance, but we, being the limited and biased creatures that we are, can know the significance of only a few such things at a time. So we need a way of saying, this one's important. And this is true for each of these meanings, the place, the site, the occasion, and in a way that is especially pertinent to such a group as ourselves, haiku poets, preternaturally interested as we are in this one. Take place, for instance. Just now, strangely enough, Zoom is ba. Victoria is a place, and it could have been ba, but as it turns out, it's not. Strange as it is to say, Zoom is where it's happening. Zoom is where, as a consequence of what has come before, like-minded men and women exist. Victoria is very nice, but Zoom is ba. This ba, this knowledge of the situation, can take so many shapes and directions that it's impossible to list them all. But you can gather that at its largest, it signifies a grounding of who we are right now, in this place, at this time. The whole package that we might sum up as our awareness, our consciousness, our reality. So here we are. Ba. Now what? The answer is, perhaps not surprisingly, now everything. Ba is the basis for pretty much everything we do in haiku. In fact, ba is the message of haiku, so here we are. Of course, haiku is not message-driven, and I don't mean to suggest that the value of all haiku can be reduced to this simple mantra, but I do wish to argue that ba is the jumping-off point, without which we wouldn't really know what or how any particular haiku means. And in fact, we depend upon it in all instances to ground our poems, to make them mean something to others. In fact, acquiring ba was the learning curve we all experienced when we first came to haiku. Ba is the place where haiku reside, and while it is possible to write poems in haiku form or on haiku topics without a sense of it, one cannot be said to have written haiku until one finds that place and dwells there. Further, the specific sense of what ba might be has come to us in a very definite way, for historical and political reasons, and it's worth our time to explore these reasons and the powerful effect this has had on the conception and practice of Western haiku. First, though, let's consider how ba has affected us in our own writing. Think back to those early days of our haiku apprenticeship. Remember those poems that we wrote in the throes of our first infatuation? How we carefully counted syllables, neatly arranged our lines, flush left, staggered, or indented 1 and 3. How we toyed with this adjective or that. I'd like to use malleable, but perverse has the 2 syllables I have left. And when it was done, how pleased we were. We'd done it, and it was surely one of the best things ever done in the form. How pithily it stated the profundity of its vision. How deftly it married the mellifluousness of the language with the wisdom of the ages. And we mailed it off to modern frog nerves with our self-addressed stamped envelope, looking forward to our dollar's return. We don't do this for the money, of course. And when it did come back, it contained no dollar, but a terse note saying, "Not quite," or "Are you serious?" or "Have you considered taking up golf instead?" And we were convinced that haiku editors were idiots if they couldn't find the artistry, the craftsmanship, the deep sense of our little gems. Obviously, this did not discourage us, or at least not enough. So here we are. And now, in hindsight, we might look back upon those times and admit, grudgingly, that perhaps, yes, those editors did know a thing or two, that maybe there was a thing about haiku that we didn't yet fully possess, and that, yes, maybe the language was a bit stilted and perhaps the lines padded out, and just possibly we were trying to make a point through abstraction or philosophizing. Okay, let's admit it. Maybe they were right. Now we can look back on those times, and perhaps we can smile. We've come over to the other side, and if it were our task to have to reevaluate those same poems right now, we'd have to admit we'd reject them too. What's happened to us? Have we simply given up and given in, kowtowing to the prevailing notions of haiku in our time in order to get published once in a while? Well, maybe some of us feel that way, but I'm guessing most of us recognize that we've learned a few things along the way. Some things that make the writing of haiku more difficult, more challenging, more artful. What we've learned, in fact, is ba. T.S. Eliot, in his essay Tradition and the Individual Talent, wrote, quote, "No poet, no artist of any art, has his complete meaning alone," end quote. By which he meant that no artist invented himself in a vacuum. Rather, all artistic meaning arises from both an understanding of, as well as a break with, the tradition that is the ground of that art. And for proof, we need look no further than ourselves. What did we make of the first haiku we saw? Even if it came clear to us, how could we evaluate it other than to say whether we liked it or not, whatever that might have meant to us at the time? And if we looked at this same poem again today, knowing what we now know, would we not regard that poem differently? What's been added? Our knowledge of haiku, its practices, its practitioners. In short, ba. That which is a consequence of what has happened before. Eliot again, quote, "Someone said, the dead writers are remote from us because we know so much more than they did." Precisely, and they are that which we know, end quote. Now, it's true that every one of us and every poem contains its own ba. So it's not so simple as to say, either you know everything you need to know about haiku and so are included in the group, or you do not and so you are not. What is significant about Eliot's realization is that at least some part of what we are doing as poets must find its breath and life within the tradition of poetry. If I were asked to write a poem and took out a chisel and carved a figure out of stone, you might say that's very nice, or not. But what I wanted was a poem. To think that a sculpture would be an equal swap suggests my lack of understanding of the history of poetry, where no poems have previously come in the shape of sculpted stone. This doesn't mean that they won't in the future, but for the moment we have no means of communicating with each other because I haven't spoken intelligibly within the tradition, that is, within ba. And if I argue that that's what I mean by poem, well, that's fine, but I'm going to have trouble communicating with others who have a more historically accurate sense of what's usually been meant by the word. So it is with less extreme distinctions as well. I may well have my own idea of what poetry is or ought to be, and that's fine. That will help the art to grow if I'm any good and I can manage to say something important, interestingly, and well. And we can call this my personal Ba. But if none of my readers is able to connect with it, that is, if it doesn't line up with the historical and communal Ba, then we'll all end up frustrated and nothing will be accomplished. So while no poem can be completely outside of Ba in the personal sense, it is ultimately the communal sense that we measure it against. And we know this to be true. Poems that come from outside Ba, even when witty or poetic or poignant, are often laughable from within it. We have all encountered poems written for the popular market. Take, for example, this one. I wait for you to clean the rugs. Here, my best hairball to date. By Deborah Coates from her book, Cat Haiku. We can, of course, find the story in this, and even with a casual glance, ascertain that it's been written according to the formula. But even with the aid of that book's title, we can't find Ba, and for a good reason. It's not present. Not that the poem doesn't have a context, it's just not haiku's context, but rather that of the poet. When a poet has come to terms with Ba, he or she might make these two contextual ideas coincide. In fact, that's what we mean to be accomplished. What haiku poet has been more idiosyncratically herself than Marlene Mountain? And yet, here we are. Pig and I, spring rain. Why does Marlene's pig possess more Ba than Deborah's cat? Is it just that we know Marlene and her work, or is it something else? After all, we're talking about 5 words, 5 syllables. How can this be enough to create a world and an empathy? And the answer is, it isn't. What makes it whole, what makes it resonate, is Ba, knowledge of the situation. This is old news in the haiku world. The significance of Ba has been crucial to the understanding of classical Japanese haiku for centuries. It was the discovery and implementation of Ba, in fact, that elevated haiku from a punny leisure activity to a serious literary pursuit. Consider as an example this poem by Teishitsu, chief pupil of Teitoku, who founded the Teitoku school, the dominant school of haiku just prior to Basho. Coolness condensing in the air. The midnight moon. It's obvious to us that this style of poem comes from an earlier understanding of haiku. It's what we call a poetic conceit, that is, an overdriven metaphor, which in this case is intended to be a bit of a witty surprise as well. And we can appreciate it. There is something interesting in the notion that the air might gather itself into a solid block of coolness, especially after a hot day. And then, there it is, its refreshing whiteness shining down on what had been parched and hot before, the other side of the day, the goddess of the night, the moon. So as these things go, this is pretty good. But if it's so good, why did it disappear? The truth is, it hasn't. There are thousands of poems written like this every year, and some of them find their way into print. Consider, for example, this one. The mystery is, here is the fork in the road. But which way is up? William Warner in his book, Corporate Haiku. You may prefer one or another of these, but the impetus and the level of accomplishment is about the same. It's apparent both poets can count, both are capable of creating a bit of suspense, both can reach a level of achievement, and certainly both are better than what we usually get from an absolute beginner, say. When dawn is breaking, rustic leaves gusting in the wind, the pumpkin shivers. By Ron Dawson from his book, A Cache of Haiku. This is not meant to be an indictment of Ron Dawson or his poetry. We all start somewhere. However, Mr. Dawson has had the bad advice, or judgment, to put a substantial portion of his early work into the public sphere, and so has needlessly exposed himself to a certain amount of criticism. But if he wants to, if he reads and studies and practices, Mr. Dawson will get better. And how will he get better? He will acquire Ba. I could be wrong, but my assumption is that neither Ms. Coates nor Mr. Warner has any interest in getting any better. As we all know, improvement is not an instantaneous process, nor is it automatic, no matter how much we desire it. Consider this one. Well, nothing happened, and yesterday has come and gone. Fugu soup. For those of you who don't know, fugu, what we call blowfish, is a Japanese delicacy which, if not properly prepared, can paralyze and kill the eater. Isn't the playfulness of this poem very like that of Teishitsu and Warner? We can easily imagine the poet, probably a young man, eating fugu on a dare, and now, safely on the other side of yesterday, watch him crow a bit. I did it, and live to tell the tale. But bravado aside, nothing about the poem invites deeper reflection. It's just a joke. And who is the author of this poem? Yes, it's Basho, but before he became Basho. This poem originates from around 1678, when he was 34, so the poet was no newbie at this point. He had been studying for 7 years with his mentor Soin in Edo, was considered by this point a rising star of the Danrin school, and had even taken on Sampu and Kikaku as students. Yet it's easy to identify this as a relatively immature effort. Compare it with this. On a withered branch, a crow has settled. Autumn evening. It's not just the somberness of the content that has changed here. Everything's different, not least the poet himself. This poem, written in 1680, only 2 years later, suggests what a great distance Basho has come. He had moved beyond the ba of his mentors and was now creating his own. This movement from amusement to literature is the reason why we're here today. If haiku had remained the jokey plaything it was prior to Basho, then it would have had its 15 minutes and disappeared, just as the purveyors of contemporary trash haiku will have their populist fling, and then we will hear no more of them. And this seems fitting. Very little has actually been accomplished with these poems, and in fact, if any of us turned our minds to it, I'm sure we would have no difficulty writing, in the space of an hour or two, quite a good-sized book of trash haiku on virtually any subject we might think of. And perhaps we should. Perhaps at the next HNA, we'll schedule a workshop on commercial haiku, brainstorm a topic, and let it fly. It might even be fun. But even if we did, would that be enough to compel us to alter our routines, endure the hardships of travel, take days off from work without pay, to gather and discuss them? Why bother? Yet, here we are. And it's Basho's fault. Basho and his followers and their followers, and the translators and the critics and theorists, the early practitioners and our fellow, well, okay, it's all our own fault. Since we recognize the power of Ba and featured it in our poems, we've made something significant of it, something more than just a nonce poetry. It may not make us rich or famous, but it has something that keeps calling to us, and we answer back. Yes, Ba has had a powerful effect on our lives. How did this come about? It's one thing for Basho to adapt a local literary tradition, but quite another for completely different cultures to identify and adopt it. As we well know, Japan was a closed culture for a very long time, so we in the West knew nothing of its early literary practices. Only after the so-called opening of the islands by Commodore Perry in 1853 could we begin to learn what kinds of things were happening there. And even then, there were few non-Japanese who could speak the language and had the wherewithal to interpret what they were witnessing. And, as haiku was an art wholly endemic to Japan, its interpretation was made all the more difficult. Nevertheless, as early as 1869, a mere 16 years after Perry's invasion, the first non-Japanese book of haiku appeared, and of course in Bulgarian. It was, of course, a book of translations of original Japanese poems. Even so, consider the challenge. Even if you get the words right, what do they mean together? And even if we catch the literal and idiomatic meanings, how do we discover their poetic sense? Isn't this just like our own first encounters with haiku? But with this important difference. When we encountered this unknown poetry, we had resources available to us to learn more. The earliest writers and translators, on the other hand, had either to ask the Japanese or make the best guesses of which they were capable, given their own understandings and capabilities. That is, given their own ba. This accounts for the interesting, if wrong-headed, assumptions and dictums we find from this period, such as Basil Hall Chamberlain referring to haiku as a poetical epigram. Nevertheless, for the first time, non-Japanese could begin to fathom what haikai poets had been working at for those many centuries. Not until Lafcadio Hearn took up residence in Japan in the 1890s was thoughtful and balanced consideration given to what had been attempted. And even then, Hearn was no specialist. His primary interest was folk tales. It was another decade before other scholars, Japanese and outsiders, began publishing their considerations of what haiku were. At the same time we were importing their culture, the Japanese were importing ours. Amongst the ideas that gained a foothold in Japanese culture at this time were a new foundation for commerce, a familiarity with Western philosophical dualism, and an acceptance of Western-style arts, especially painting and literature. Some of the modes of the day imported wholesale into Japanese discourse included naturalism, surrealism, and Dada. In fact, there was real concern in the 1920s that the Japanese might jettison their entire way of life for a Western mode of being. This free market cultural exchange has had an enormous impact on, among many other things, the history of haiku in the West. I don't mean simply that haiku was coaxed out of its indigenous home to be interpreted by Lafcadio Hearn, revisioned by Ezra Pound, and contextualized by R.H. Blythe, though these things are extremely important. Even beyond that, something was going on in haiku in Japan that was unprecedented and which has never been repeated, at precisely the moment we began taking it on board here. As we recollect, Basho had elevated haiku in the 17th century to a literary art. It remained in good health for a time, as his disciples kept the practice alive and taught others well. But after a time, and inevitably, haiku declined, returning again to wordplay and slickness of treatment, as opposed to the depths of emotion and illusion that it had come to feature at its zenith. There were 3 revivals of haiku as high art, each centering on the work and personality of a particular master of the art. I'm getting some bird play here. The third revaluation of haiku was led by a young, ambitious poet, Masaoka Shiki. Shiki was quite interested in the cross-cultural exchange that had come to Japan. His first love was that ancient and honorable Japanese sport, baseball. He studied the English language in high school and had a taste for Western art, particularly representational painting, which was to have a marked effect on his own opinions of what constituted good art. And, of course, he was deadly serious about haiku. And we know the result. Shiki retooled the moribund haiku into an objectivist art, replete with a model of composition, chassé, and a revaluation of the pantheon. Buzan became his exemplar, replacing the subjective and heterodox Basho. Or, to put it in the terms of this conference, he jettisoned the ethos of 400 years of haiku for something like the philosophy of the Hudson River School. Shiki changed the foundation of haiku by changing its ba. But to argue his case, Shiki reinterpreted the history of haiku in Japan in a way that the poets themselves would have rejected. Buzan, for instance, was no objectivist. His model was Basho, and his variance from the earlier master was one of style, not poetics. Consider this famous poem. Resting upon the temple bell, sleeping butterfly. Shiki singles this out as exemplary of what haiku ought to be, image-based, pictorial, and immediate. A sketch from nature, perfect chassé. In fact, Shiki considers this poem to exemplify what he terms positive beauty, a Western attribute as he saw it, and as opposed to the traditional negative beauty which marked so-called Oriental art. The translators and interpreters who followed concurred. Miyamori calls it an artless little verse, and a mere simple objective description. Blythe follows with, "There is nothing symbolized," and continues, "However objective it may be, we feel the intensity and absorption of the poet and butterfly as one thing." Really? Is that what Busan had in mind? Or are Shiki and Miyamori and Blythe simply arguing for their interpretations? In fact, Busan's poem is a web of allusions, not least to the famous dream of Chuang-Tzu, who could not say if he were a man dreaming of being a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming he was a man. I doubt any literate Japanese could read this poem without being reminded of this incident, much less a poet, and especially a poet of Busan's caliber. Beyond this, there is an allusion to a no play by Zeami called Takasago, and an episode in the Genji Monogatari, though both of them are based on this same classical original. And of course, it plays ironically with Moritake's famous falling leaf rising butterfly poem. But most of all, it alludes directly to Basho's "You're the butterfly, and I'm Chuang-Tzu's dreaming heart." To deny the possibility of allusion and symbolism to Busan's poem is like saying that Moby Dick must be read as a straightforward account of a fishing expedition. It's possible to do so, but why would you want to? This doesn't mean that Busan never saw a butterfly on the temple bell. We don't know if he did, and it doesn't matter. What we do know is that wherever he got his material, he knew how to turn it into poetry. To denude such haiku of its allusion is to strip it of its fetch, and to reduce it to little more than a journal entry. The entire corpus of Busan's work contains the same sort of elusive material. Simultaneously, we can go through Shiki's reading of Busan's poems and find the same reductionism at work. This is too bad for Busan, but what of it? Why should it matter to us 2 centuries later? It matters because of the manner in which it has affected the very way in which you and I and all Westerners have come to view haiku, narrowly limiting what haiku have traditionally been by making the least out of that which makes haiku so distinctive. It's ba. Throughout the 20th century, Shiki and his disciples held the dominant position in Japanese haiku, so that Japanese poets and scholars had similar difficulties as non-Japanese in getting more subjective, illusion-driven work published and into circulation. The model was the Shasei, the premier publication Hototogisu, and the dominant organization, the Modern Haiku Association. But in the past 3 decades, this has begun to change. Poets and scholars have come to recognize that the hegemony of the Shiki model has come at the expense of a proper valuing of the entirety of the haiku tradition. Basho is making a comeback in Japan, and allusion is returning to the poems published and winning awards. Haiku is returning to a more commodious sense of ba, and is the better for it. Nothing has been more fundamental to the historical understanding of haiku than this sense of knowledge of the situation. Technical issues like syllable counting in Kigo, and content issues such as the inclusion of non-classical topics and the distinction between haiku and senryu come and go, but this issue of the so here we are-ness, this ba-ness of haiku, goes on and on. And the proper domain of this, of course, is not culture or language, but our minds. Ultimately, ba is the realm of mind, a subjective realm, to be sure, but not necessarily a realm in isolation. In fact, it is the cooperation of minds that makes culture and language possible. There can be no conception of objective reality without the subjective reality that underpins it, our own consciousness. And if we can bring mind to bear on our art, then we are capable of making more of it than simply sketching from nature. In fact, we must. We are capable of understanding the ba, out of which can be written, "A wind arrives from the future that blows the waterfall apart." Banya Natsui Shi in a future waterfall. If we cavil, as objectivists might, that this is not a sketch from nature, then we have missed an opportunity to dwell in that which makes us unique in nature, our imaginations. And at the same time, this imagination, part of us, is part of nature as well. Literature is capable of giving us a clue, not to what is true, but to what we think we're being true to. And while that's not everything, it's a lot. And it makes our taking pains to find Ba and maintain it worth the effort. So, here we are. What are we going to make of it?